Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Human-Centered Design, Design Thinking, and Community Change. This is the first of our Community Change Festival webinar series. Today, Galen will be presenting an introductory webinar exploring human-centered design, design thinking, and their relevance for community change makers. This is the first in our Community Change Festival series, and Tamarack will be hosting the Community Change Festival October 1 to October 4th in Toronto, Ontario. And over 4 days, you can explore the 5 interconnected practices every changemaker needs to move ideas to practice to impact. And community innovation is one of those 5 interconnected practices. You can learn more about the event and register at events.tamarackcommunity.ca/community-change-festival. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Galen MacLusky. Galen is the Consulting Director, Community Innovation for Tamarack Institute's Learning Center. He is passionate about working with community organizations to build and scale new ideas that deepen their impact. An experienced design, innovation, and co-creation consultant, at the core of his work are approaches that help organizations engage with those who are impacted by their services and test new programs and services with minimal investment. Welcome, Galen.
Thanks a lot, Duncan, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar today. One of the things that I always feel I miss about webinars is that I can't see you or really interact with you all too much. So please do use the text box that Duncan mentioned. Send your questions through, and Duncan will be able to ask them as we go through. And I just want to walk us through a little bit about what to expect today. So I'm actually going to start with a little bit of a story to ground us in human-centered design and design thinking. It's actually a story from some work I did in the past. And it really gives us a starting point for talking about what human-centered design and design thinking are and are not. And then the bulk of our conversation today will actually be kind of a deep dive into the core principles and practice behind design thinking. So specifically empathy, ideation, and experimentation. And as I said, one of the challenging things with a webinar is that there isn't a huge amount of interactivity, but there will be opportunities in each of those sections to reflect, to have a bit of a Q&A that Duncan will facilitate. And I've also got some activities for each of you to try on your own as well during those times. So hopefully this is going to be a chance to not just hear about design thinking, but a chance to explore and experiment with it a little bit. So my hope really is that by the end of today's webinar, you're going to have tangible ways that you can strengthen your community change efforts that are rooted in the practice of design thinking. That's what my goal is. And really, I want this to be as practical and applied as possible. So I mentioned I'd start with a story, and a few years ago, I was working on designing social enterprise within a Honduran town. That's the town pictured in the background. It's Candelaria, Honduras. And we were brought in with a partnership with a local nonprofit and the town as well to really look at what sorts of possible small social enterprises might be beneficial to the community and also help keep community members in the community earning productive lives. Because one of the challenges with these types of communities is that many community members have to leave to find work elsewhere. And we started this process by really trying to understand the context of the community that we were working in and understand what some of the core issues that we'd been brought in to look at were. So we were looking at things like waste management, we were looking at things like the supply of water and electricity. And so we actually started our project by getting hands-on with a lot of these services around town. So rather than just asking people about them, we actually took on the opportunity to be garbage collectors for a day to see how the town's waste management infrastructure worked. That's me getting a little bit of a face full of garbage. We also spent a lot of time with community residents, understanding their perspectives, what their needs, aspirations, and challenges were. And this is something that will come up a lot in our discussion around design thinking, really starting from a place of looking to understand what the context we were working in was. And as we continued our work, we started to generate a lot of different ideas. So this is, I feel every design thinking presentation should probably have some sort of slide with lots of ideas laid out. But really, our experiences in understanding the community sparked a lot of different conversations about what might be possible from the perspective of social enterprise. We then took these ideas out into the world, and we actually showed them at different levels of scale and fidelity to community members to get their perspectives on what would be most helpful, what was least helpful. And again, this iterative process really helped us much more clearly hone in on what was valuable and meaningful to them and what wasn't. So really trying to get out of our own heads and really design something that was impactful and meaningful for them. And as we honed in on the final design of the business that we developed with the town council, which was very much framed around sustainable organic fertilizer that was created from diverted organic waste, we started to prototype things in the community. So this is actually our first early prototype of a waste collection truck that we have actually divided into organic and inorganic collection. We also created organic and inorganic drop zones across the community, and we actually started up a compost heap as well, all while we were in the community. And we put together a pretty robust business proposal. The town council got really excited, and then we left the community and we didn't hear back from them. And this really points to a real challenge with this kind of drop-in community change work, really where the work is being driven from people outside the community. And it was a huge learning experience for me. And it also really helped me think about what applying things like design thinking and human-centered design would mean, not so much from an outsider trying to apply them to a problem-solving process for a community, but for communities themselves using these methods and tools and approaches to solve the challenges that they're working on. So there are some really important takeaways that this experience helped reinforce, and also through my career later on as a design consultant. There are some things that came through really clearly. Number one is that design thinking is absolutely not a silver bullet. It is not the answer to every problem that you have, and it's actually somewhat challenging if we treat it that way. I think this example is a great one where I'd say we applied a pretty straightforward design thinking process and really didn't achieve the result that we hoped for. But through my subsequent years working as a design thinking consultant, I've really grown to appreciate how much these approaches can be helpful for communities as they work to create, test, and build community change. And that's really what I hope to share with you today. So I mentioned first that I wanted to provide some guide rails around what design thinking and human-centered design are and are not. And for all intents and purposes, design thinking and human-centered design are more or less used to refer to the same sorts of things. Within the design space, there are some differences in ways that people talk about them differently, but for most people using these methods, they're more or less interchangeable. They refer to the same broad set of series of activities. They refer to the same broad set of approaches. And these sets of approaches are really grounded in design practice. So historically, people like architects, industrial designers would use an iterative and human-centered process to explore their craft, to evolve things. So these particular design practices don't look at creating the perfect design right off the bat. In fact, they treat design as a very iterative, collaborative process. And then there were organizations like IDEO that really built upon these practices and started applying these practices to all sorts of problems that were outside of the domain of architecture and industrial design. And that's where now we have quite a proliferation of design thinking and human-centered design across all sectors, across all industries, because they provide some really interesting ways of going about tackling the challenges that we face. So if I were to draw upon a framework to understand what design thinking is, this one seems like a pretty strong one. It really highlights that there are kind of 5 core components of a design thinking process. Empathizing, so understanding the challenge and exploring the human context. Defining what the challenge is and why it's important and creating a clear point of view. Ideating, looking to generate multiple different ideas and possible ways to solve the challenge that we've identified. And then prototyping, creating possible solutions and putting them then out in the world and testing them and seeing whether what we have created actually solves the challenge that we hoped or not. And what's really important with this process is it's not a single 5-step process. It is iterative. And in practice, it's actually quite a loose process. Empathizing doesn't need to flow directly to defining, to ideating, to prototyping. Very often design teams will move between these stages quite fluidly. So we might conduct user interviews and an ethnography, which I'll get into a little bit later what that is, on the empathize side. And then we might move straight into prototyping if that feels appropriate. And that's one thing that's really, really challenging about applying a design thinking process, particularly in the early stages as you're getting familiar with it. So this diagram by Damien Newman really summarizes, I think, what a design thinking process feels like. Whereas the previous diagram seems very ordered and straightforward, design thinking in practice can feel very, very chaotic, very intuitive, very much driven by heuristics, but inevitably it ends up creating something at the end that is usually quite valuable. And then with that, that's not the most optimistic thing for those of us who are interested in getting started with design thinking right away. But there are some really core practices that that underpin all of this messy, chaotic, iterative work. And those practices are empathy, ideation, and experimentation. And so while it might seem really daunting to approach the process in the diagram that's on the screen right now, this messy squiggle that who knows what's going on there. These 3 core practices are actually really, really good entry points for anyone who's interested in exploring the value of design thinking and how you might start to bring design thinking into your work and your processes. So that's really where I want to focus our intro session on today. And I think that the main takeaways from this overview is that design thinking is not a step-by-step recipe for success. No matter how it's positioned or used, it is very, very much a loose, iterative process that depends a lot on judgment and not on checkboxes or stage gate models. And also, design thinking is not just simply having good ideas. It's not something that people who are inherently creative own and no one else can use. Instead, design thinking is a practice that is built over time, and it is something that you can absolutely build over time in your community change work as well. So the question then becomes, what's our entry point? For those of us who are really interested in this field, these approaches, how do we start to apply this work to the work of community change? And I want to pause just for 10 seconds and have you think about the following question before we dive into empathy. I want you to think about how well do you know the people who are impacted by your work on a scale of 1 to 5? You don't need to enter it into the chat box. This is just for you. But 1 being we know absolutely nothing about them, and number 5 being we are in their heads and we understand exactly what they're thinking and feeling, and we know what they need. And I want to emphasize here that knowing about is not quite the same as knowing as you're thinking about answering this question. So I'll give you about 5 more seconds just to think about that. And the reason I asked that question is because that question is central to the practice of empathy. And so within the context of design thinking, empathy is really about incorporating the perspective of context experts. So these are different from content experts, people who we often see as experts. You know, there are professors, our thought leaders, people like that. Context experts are people whose lived experience gives them their own unique expertise on the types of change that we're trying to affect. Context experts are people who live in our community. They're people who experience the challenge that we're trying to address firsthand. And a big part of design thinking is involving context experts in designing the types of change that they want to see. And this really begins from a place of acknowledging that we, the people who are not context experts, can never truly know someone other than ourselves. But we can learn from them, and we can do some things to try and understand what their perspectives might be. So I wanted to share a little bit of a story that actually comes from the book Playing to Win by A.G. Lafley, who's the CEO of Procter & Gamble, which is a big organization that draws upon design thinking a lot. And there was a team that was working to try and design a new razor for men in India to use to shave. And the leader of the team actually asked their whole team to fly to India and spend 2 weeks with these people to understand what their experience of shaving was before they started approaching the design of a razor for them. And as the story goes, one of the top designers was quite resistant to the idea. They really questioned, you know, what were we going to learn from this? Why would we take all of this time, 2 weeks out of everyone's schedule, to go and fly down and just be with people when we really know how shaving is done? It's pretty simple. It's a razor, it's a face. And what was really interesting is when the team did in fact go down, they found that they had made some very, very critical assumptions that were incorrect about what shaving looked like for the men that they were trying to design the razor for. The number one thing being is that most of the men they were designing for didn't have access to running water for shaving. So then a razor needed to be able to withstand those types of conditions that we here in North America often don't have. We have running water quite accessible and available to us, so we can clean the razor, we can flush it out. And on the plane ride home, this lead designer who had challenged the overall idea sketched out this new concept that became a bestseller in India, and really was inspired by this experience of having his assumptions challenged through this process. And it seems like a relatively obvious thing, you know, why couldn't they have figured this out? But it's actually really challenging as individuals to tell the difference between what we know and what we think we know. We so readily make assumptions about what we know about someone else's lived experience and their life. And the body of design thinking work very much takes the position that we don't know what we think we know. And there's a lot of tools that we can then employ to resolve this tension. So there's lots of tools that help designers and people who want to adopt a design thinking approach build this practice of empathy. Things like ethnography, which is the systematic study of a population or a community. Things like co-creation, where we might actually bring people with lived experience into the room, create a number of exercises to help them build the type of change that they want to see. Things like observations and interviews and empathy maps are all tools that design thinkers use to try and overcome this really important cognitive hurdle that we actually don't know what someone else's experience is. And whether you draw upon these tools or not, the main principles behind this are really twofold. One, that if we want to create effective change, we need to be with the people that we hope to create effective change with. Uh, there's so many different examples of outsiders coming in and trying to affect change in community with little understanding of the community itself, and those things often don't work. And so the number one principle is actually finding ways to be with people. And then number two is when we are with them, being open to learning from them. And this is particularly important for the work of community change because often when we're approaching change, we have our own perspectives on what is needed in our communities, what is important, what people want. But really following through on these two principles, on finding ways to be with others and learn from them and expand our own horizons, helps make sure that we're actually tackling the right problem or using the right assets as opposed to thinking that we are, but not actually doing it. So that's kind of the basic stance on empathy that I hope that you can pull forward into all of your work. There's nothing hugely complicated about trying to find ways to be with people and learn from them. And however works best in your community is what works. But I really want to encourage you as you're drawing on design thinking as a practice to really focus on those two things. And so what I'd like to do while we take a short break just for one or two questions on empathy is just to take the next 2 minutes for yourself and plan how you personally will connect with someone that your work impacts, just as a person, not even in your professional role. So there's a number of different things you could consider. You could ask your relatives or friends if they know anyone who's impacted by your work. You could make a list of places where these people commonly spend time and actually go there and visit with them. You could invite someone to join you for coffee. And you could make a list of the things that you're really curious to learn about from people with this perspective. I think that this particular point is really important because so often in our day-to-day work, we just get focused on advancing community change or solving the problem that's staring us in the face. It's much less often that we take the time to step back and really engage with the people who we think we're trying to support or work with and hear what they have to say. So I'll give you some time to just work on your own personal plan. And in the meantime, Duncan, have there been any questions that came through on empathy? If you haven't had a chance to type in your questions through the chat box, please do. Duncan will be collecting them and asking them for you.
Thanks, Galen. I think we have time for one question here. And one point that comes up time and time again is that when we're trying to empathize with those who are impacted with our work, sometimes we realize that people haven't always done a good job of doing that. And there is kind of a brokenness to that relationship. So in order to empathize with that community, how do we go ahead and try to heal that relationship so that we can actually meaningfully engage with them?
I think, yeah, that's a great question, and one that comes up in a lot of our work because very often we're trying to support populations that are marginalized in one way or another. And I think that's the place I want to start with thinking about this question, is often a position of marginalization is a position where people have been denied power. And so I think number one, if you find that you're in this kind of relationship, number one is turning the power back to them and giving people the opportunity to weigh in on whether they do or don't want to be engaged in the first place. And then B, giving them the opportunity to say how they want to be engaged if they do. I think often we approach people and groups assuming that they care about our initiative or they want to work with us, but really taking the time up front to ask those types of questions, and then also being willing, when they say no, we don't want to engage with you, to be willing to step away and accept that. I think that's probably the best starting point for starting to repair these kinds of relationships, because so often they're very much based on these power dynamics. So I think that's the first place we can start.
Perfect. Thanks, Galen. We have a couple other questions, but I think we might have to get to them at the Q&A portion at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So moving on from empathy, the next reflective question I'd like you to think about is, how easy is it for you, and this can be you personally or the community or organization you work with, to generate creative new approaches to the challenges that you're working on? So once again, the scale is from 1 to 5. 1 is not at all. We're only dealing with the same old approaches and it feels like nothing's new. And number 5 is, it's easy. We've got tons of new creative ideas out all the time. And this is really the central question that the practice and principle of ideation is focused on. So there's a lot of really good resources in the design thinking space on how to carve out time, space, and safety for new ideas, and also how we can work to unblock some of the very common creativity blocks that we have. Things like fear of failure, cultural taboos, where we won't suggest ideas that might be embarrassing, our tendency to default towards certain solutions. Design thinking often talks a lot about using multiple different thinking languages. So for example, mathematics are a particular type of thinking language. So is the written word, but also so is sketching and model making. Perceptual blocks and lack of rewards. All of these are some really, really common types of creativity blocks that we face. And this whole body of work around ideation is understanding how we unblock those. And there's a few key words that you'll probably see a lot if you continue to explore design thinking as a practice that you want to engage with. There are things like rules of brainstorming, which help groups create time and space for ideas to be shared openly. Design principles are a way of summarizing what we've learned through our empathy exercises and then using that to spark creativity and ideation. Things like how might we questions are ways of framing brainstorming questions to help really spark this kind of creativity. And other things like journey maps and personas are frameworks that can help us collect a lot of the different information we've been hearing and give us some very, very clear and straightforward starting points for sparking creativity and ideation. So very much of these tools are really about creating the frame where new ideas can be heard and acknowledged. And the one that I wanted to dive into a little bit today, because it's probably the easiest to implement for anyone who's interested in getting started, are the rules of brainstorming. And these particular rules are from Stanford's design school. And they are as follows. So number 1 is seeking to defer a judgment. So one of the challenges with suggesting creative ideas is that we're afraid that other people might judge them, or that we be ridiculed for the ideas that we suggested. So what happens then as a result of this fear is that people build internal blocks to suggesting ideas. I don't know if you've ever had the experience when you're in your head and you're thinking, oh no, that's not a good idea. Oh, that's not a good idea. Oh, that's not a good idea either. And you end up suggesting nothing. That's exactly why we need to create a space where judgment is deferred. And then to the second point, really encouraging wild ideas in a group. Uh, Particularly in a group setting, being able to highlight and reward the wild ideas helps create a space where everyone realizes that it's not just the best ideas that are useful, it's all ideas. What we really want is to tap into everyone's collective ideas. And later on, we can start to identify which ideas are most appropriate for the challenge that we're working on. These two go really hand in hand with trying to break down that self-filtering block, which is a really strong block to creative thinking. Building on the ideas of others is also a really good way to show to people that their ideas are valuable. Oftentimes, someone's idea might not be exciting to us, but it can spark another thought and another thought and another thought. And so the real value in these types of conversations is not whether an idea is good or bad or not, but simply the fact that we have ideas floating around that can inspire us. And so that's why that build on the ideas of others and then go for volume also are really focused on trying to get us to what we need. We don't need really good ideas right now. We need lots of ideas. And then the last two are really about how we hold space in an idea generation session. So making sure that we have one conversation at a time so that all of our focus is on the person who's suggesting an idea so that we have the opportunity to be inspired and acknowledge their contribution to the table. And headline is also a way of making sure that we don't spend 10 minutes sharing our incredibly convoluted idea. It's really about helping people make sure that they spend 1 or 2 sentences articulating their idea and then give the space to someone else. So these are 6 rules that are really, really helpful anytime that you're thinking about soliciting ideas or getting a group to think creatively about the type of challenge that they're facing. And they're very, very often not followed in practice. And so I have a question here just for reflection is how many of your meetings break at least one of these rules versus how many don't? And that's why this intentional practice of ideation is so important. Some of these things seem very, very straightforward, and they are, but a lot of our routines and meetings don't follow them really strongly. And so being able to introduce these as principles and practices to follow and setting up people who can help make sure that these rules get followed during the time that we're brainstorming are really, really key. And the core with ideation in the context of design thinking is really that we need to create the space to separate generation of ideas from the judgment of ideas, because that fear of judgment is one of the biggest blocks to creative thinking. And the other thing that I find we often don't do, particularly in professional practice, is that we play. We create spaces where we can be fun and relaxed and have ideas that spark curiosity and exploration, because so often we're fighting deadlines and huge social challenges that are very serious and important. It feels like play is a superfluous thing. But in this context, play is actually a really helpful way to start to work through some of those conceptual barriers that help us really think creatively about the situations that we face. So again, as with empathy, I have a little bit of an exercise for you to do right now to reflect on this. And I'd like you to pick one of the following 3 or more than one of the following 3 if you like, and start to think about things that you can bring to brainstorming and idea generation in your community and in your organization. So one option would be to actually bring the rules of brainstorming into your community. And one thing that's really important with this is if you do that, make sure that you do have the opportunity to introduce it and discuss it with the group before you start to use it in practice, just so people can get on the same page about what it all means and they understand the importance of these types of rules of brainstorming, and also so that the community can own those rules themselves. Another thing you can do is start to think about fun things that you can do to spark creative ideas. It may seem silly, but lots of design thinking organizations make sure that there's candy or snacks around because it really does help give people kind of the mental fuel and quick hits of energy that they need to keep up in an active brainstorming session. Things like smelly markers and stickers and other sorts of things that people can use as they're sharing their ideas are also really subtle ways to start bringing in this idea of play and almost a return to the ways that we would explore ideas as children. I don't know if for those of you who do have children, it often feels like kids are way more creative about how they approach the world than adults. And that's very much a process that feels that we've unlearned as we've grown up. So a lot of this is about tapping into those old memories and old ways of thinking. And the last thing you could do if you're facilitating a session like this is thinking about the ways that you could actually reward the types of behavior that you want to see. So for example, I mentioned that really generating ideas and the sheer number of ideas is one of the greatest things we can do during idea generation sessions. So you might choose rewards or celebrations for people who generate the most ideas, or you might reward people who build off of someone else's ideas first, or things like that, to really get the group going after the types of behaviors that are important and not focusing on whether their idea is good or not. And while you think about that, I think we probably have a time for one question. Is that right, Duncan?
Yeah, that's right, Galen. We had a couple of people ask just to make this a bit more concrete in terms of what this looks like in practice at like a community change organization. So is ideation here referring to just brainstorming to solve any problem that impacts, the people that we're serving, or is it more specific than that?
It very much varies. So if we were to contextualize it within a broader initiative that we're focusing on, say we are really looking to figure out how we end poverty in our community, for example. The practice of ideation very likely will happen many, many times over throughout the course of this type of initiative. So we might have a 20-minute session when we do a kickoff to talk about what do we think are the root causes of poverty in our community, and then we brainstorm that. We might have an ideation session when we're trying to figure out how we engage people with lived experience. So a question that we might pose to the group would be, how might we involve people with lived experience in this initiative? And then we might spend 20 minutes exploring ideas around that and generating ideas. And as we get further along, the types of questions that we ideate around are likely to become much more narrow. So become things like, how should we deliver an in-person program focused on food security? And that's then another ideation itself. So in practice, really these types of things happen all the time. Ideation happens at all scales and at all points in projects. And it's really any moment at which you have a question that's framed in the case of, how might we, or how do we approach, or how could we? Any question like that is a great opportunity to say, oh, let's maybe sit back and spend a little bit more time thinking through creative ideas on how to approach this challenge. Thanks for the questions, everyone, by the way. This is exciting. So the last reflection question I wanted you to explore is how often you experiment and test ideas before the final deadline or the final launch of whatever you're working on. This could be something as simple as a presentation to the community or to your organization, or it could be something as complex as a much larger initiative that you're working on. So once again, scale to one to 5, 1 being not at all, and 5 being always. And this brings us into the third major pillar, experimentation. And the core of experimentation is really making our ideas real before the final deadline or final release as a way to figure out whether we're on the right track or not. So in the world of design thinking, we often talk about different fidelities of prototypes or experiments. So a really, really low fidelity experiment could be something as simple as sketching your idea and showing it to people to see what they think about it. That's a super simple, super easy to do thing. But it can also get you some really valuable feedback because very often what you might imagine in your head as the idea or what the value of the idea is won't come across immediately to people. And creating something on paper that they can react to and give you suggestions on is a really, really good early way to test whether or not you're on the right track. Then things like mockups might be somewhat more complex or more high fidelity prototypes. So maybe you invite someone to sit down with you and go through a few more detailed, maybe letters you plan on sending to the community, or maybe a mock-up of a booth that you were going to set up to promote the initiative that you're working on. These take a bit more investment on your part, but also they can help you get to some more specific questions about how people react. And then really high on the fidelity of the experimentation scale is kind of a pilot, is creating something that looks and feels real, but with the intent to see how it pans out in practice. And the story I wanted to share here, I don't know if anyone remembers this particular ballot or this particular election year. But what was really interesting about the Florida electoral process in 2000 was this newly redesigned ballot and way that people had of voting. And one of the criticisms that came up after the election was that people who were trying to vote Democratic would put their bullet points or their vote in slot number 4 rather than slot number 5 as indicated on the sheet. And this created a huge problem, and I think most of us remember when that happened. One thing that's really interesting with this story is think about how easy it would have been for us to avoid this whole thing if we just tested it. If we had just had someone do a dummy vote or try using this form, someone who wasn't someone who designed it. And that's really the key with experimentation and why experimentation is so important, because when you're involved in the work of designing a voting ballot or designing a community change effort or designing a poverty reduction initiative, you are actually far, far too close to what you're working on. You're familiar with all of these assumptions about it, all of the things that you'd be thinking about and the ways that you intend people to use it. But when you take it out to someone who has never seen it before and interacted with it, that's when you find something really, really meaningful and striking. And often you can find that you've made some critical assumptions, like with this one, that this will actually be easier for people to use when in fact it creates quite a few important challenges. Instead, taking it out into the world and testing it is a way to head off those assumptions before you even go live with something like this. And it's really important because often we don't know what those assumptions are. It's actually really hard to know what they are without putting them into practice. And so there are a number of tools as well within design thinking that help us experiment. So a Wizard of Oz prototype test is a test that the person who's participating in the test doesn't actually know that the thing they're interacting with isn't real. So one example would be if we're trying to test how people interact with a chat service on our website about our community change efforts, we could actually have a live person just do that, even though the chat service hasn't been designed or perfected in any sort of way. Similarly, we can use things like role play, sketching, and physical prototyping as ways to experiment and put ideas in the world. And then also making sure that we carve out the time to test things with people, test things with what designers would call users, but in this case might be community members or people who are impacted by these services, giving them the opportunity to look at the ideas that you have, the services that you're designing, and weigh in and say, yes, this works for me, I like this, or no, I think this really doesn't work, and here's what I would do differently instead. So the core principles here are that you don't know what you don't know. And so the only way to overcome that issue is that the true test of any idea is what happens when it's in the world. And one thing that's really interesting that I think a lot of us have learned through our experiences in organizations and through our educational experiences as well, is that we're used to always working towards a final deliverable. You know, we work on our essay or our paper, we submit it, and that's it. We get a mark and it's done. But the real world doesn't need to work like that. In fact, when we have a draft of a paper and we send it to a friend and they can give us feedback on it, we learn so much more from the experience than we did if we just submitted it. And that works with pretty much anything that we're working on. It really doesn't need to be perfect to learn from it. And in fact, if we try to make it perfect, we often set up a whole bunch of blockers within ourselves to actually learning from constructive feedback and learning the ways that it doesn't work for people. So what I'd like you to do then to put that into practice is to take something, and this can really be anything you're working on. It can be the presentation you're going to give tomorrow. It can be the initiative you're working on over the next 2 years. And I want you to identify what the most important uncertainties that you have are. So essentially within this initiative, what are the make or break assumptions? What are the things that will make it or break it? So for example, if we're going with a poverty reduction initiative, one of the main assumptions that we're making is that people want to move out of poverty. That's actually a really important make or break assumption, because if we're trying to force certain things upon a population that doesn't want anything different, then we're just in for a whole bunch of wasted effort. So that's, I think, an example of one of these core uncertainties that could make or break the work that we do. And then what I'd like you to do is plan how you could test that uncertainty in the space of 1 hour. And the reason I put this constraint in is that a lot of the work around experimentation is not trying to design the perfect and right experiment, because again, that's falling into the same old trap of making everything right all the time. Design thinking is very much about moving quickly in an iterative and intelligent way. So taking a little bit of time to think about how we could test it in a really, really low fidelity, low investment way is a really good way for you to get a quick gut check on whether you're on the right track or not, and also start to build this muscle of quick, rapid, iterative testing and building. And so while we're working on that, I think maybe we'll hold the questions for experimentation to the end, because there's just a few more slides to wrap up our conversation for today. I hope really that the core of this conversation has been around empathy, ideation, and experimentation. And within the context of community change, these three practices help us focus our efforts on beneficial change. So making sure by practicing empathy that we're actually working on the types of changes that people want to see rather than the things that we think people need. The practice of ideation helps us approach our challenges in new ways so that we're not stuck working with the same challenges or the same perspectives all the time and feeling like we're not getting anywhere. And experimentation is a way for us to not just put all our eggs in one basket, but instead build small prototypes and tests and learn as we go, so that as we build momentum for the type of change we want to see, we're also making sure that our efforts more and more closely align to what works in our context and what doesn't. And one key point with these three things is that you can absolutely do all of these without using, in quotation marks, design thinking. But the body of design thinking work has a lot of really good starting points and methods and tools that can help you do these better. So if you're interested in looking at how to do these three things better, design thinking is a great place to continue to explore as you look at how you strengthen your community change efforts. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions. And it seems like things have been pretty active on the chat box. So Duncan, what's percolating?
Yeah, Galen, thanks for that. And you're right, there are lots of good questions here and probably too many for us to address them all. But I want to start off with a comment actually, rather than a question. This is from Jessica, but she mentions wanting to emphasize the importance of integrating a diversity lens into the work from the beginning, and how this is extremely critical if we want to do anything different in the future of community change, especially when we think about quote unquote marginalized people, as she mentioned. Any
Yeah,
comments on that?
no, that's a fantastic point. And often, uh, particularly in the context of design thinking, one of the core questions is, do we have people who are impacted by what we're working on around the table and sharing their perspectives? And so it's really important then in that context to be making sure that we have a diversity of perspectives around the table that we're drawing upon, because everyone's experience with our community, with the challenges and assets that we have, everyone's experience is going to be quite different. And so I think that's a perfect and spot on comment to make sure that we don't forget that diversity is critical in this kind of work.
Thanks, Galen. Next, we have a question from Megan. In the process of ideation, how does one end up deciding on what is a good idea, and how are ideas eliminated?
Great question. And so it's really important then to make sure that this is a follow-on step to the process of generation. And often what's helpful here is to have some criteria in advance or align on criteria about what sorts of ideas we would like to invest further in. So such types of criteria you might consider would be how feasible is this to implement? How impactful do we think this could be? Things like that. Those are quite high level questions. And what's interesting about moving between idea generation and then this kind of evolution and feedback and evaluation is that we're not looking generally to find the one single idea. Usually we might end up with something like 100 or 200 ideas, and maybe out of that, we might have 10 or 5 that feel like there's some promise that we can then invest a bit more time in fleshing out and getting more details on. So I think a really core thing is aligning with the group on what the evaluation criteria are, and also not trying to get too much to the number one idea, but rather trying to filter down the number so that we can work with a smaller number of ideas as we then start making tests and bets and experiments. One thing that's really interesting with that process is often if groups are stuck at any point about which ideas to move forward, that's a really great opportunity to bring in people who are affected by the ideas themselves, to ask them what they think they would like to see and what they wouldn't. It's a really quick way to get some feedback. And the last thought I'll leave you with is that very often if you end up with a pool of 200 ideas, for example, quite a lot of them will have quite a few similarities. And so going through the exercise of grouping similar ideas and maybe reframing what the overall group is or some of the key features within it is another way to also start to distill some of that complexity and some of all of those great ideas into some very specific ones that you can then work with.
Perfect. Thanks, Galen. I think we have time to squeeze one more in very quickly. And
Absolutely.
just because we had a couple questions regarding this, but how do you apply empathy to large segments of a population? For example, working on programs for the public in a province.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. And one thing that's when we talk about data and how we understand people's experiences, often there's a tension between qualitative types of data and information, so stories and people's lived experience, versus quantitative, so numbers and statistics. And what I would really recommend with a really large population is still trying to find opportunities to connect with a few very specific people. And doubtless it's going to be impossible to represent the totality of a whole province's experience just in those 5 or 10 stories that you hear when you interact with people. But being able to pair that kind of information with broad population-wide information is what helps, I think, build that kind of perspective, so that you're not blind to people's individual stories and challenges, but also have an understanding of what is happening at the aggregate level. I think that's the way to, particularly for organizations and individuals when they're trying to grapple with huge systems and population-wide change, marrying those two approaches and making sure that there's a balance between both is really how to reconcile that issue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Galen. And yeah, thanks for taking the time to walk through, empathy, ideation, and experimentation with us. I think I can speak for all of us when I say that this has been really thought-provoking, and it's a great overview. And thank you to our audience members for sharing this with us and sharing your great questions and comments. It really has helped make this a more engaging discussion. And Galen, I
Yeah,
think we have a couple announcements.
absolutely. So just echoing your thoughts as well, Duncan. Really appreciate all the interest and comments that we've had. It's been a really exciting conversation for me. So thanks everyone for joining us. Um, if you haven't seen as well, I recently released a paper on the Tamarack website, which is a bit of a deep dive into design-based approaches and their applicability to community innovation and community change. So if the topics in this webinar were interesting to you, definitely take a look at that as well. There's also a number of follow-on links and things and places where you can go to explore more and really flesh out some of the ideas that we've touched upon at a high level today. So really would encourage you to check that out. And as well, at the Community Change Festival that Duncan mentioned at the beginning, we'll be hosting this festival from October 1st to the 4th in Toronto. And one of the core interconnected practices that we're going to be exploring is community innovation and design-based methods. So over the course of these 4 days, we'll get the opportunity to be a little bit more hands-on than we were on today's webinar, and get some more interactive and applied exercises as well over the festival itself. So if this is something that you're interested in, I'd also recommend that you really check out the Community Change Festival. I will be there. I'll be running a number of different sessions, and hopefully we can meet and connect, and look forward to seeing everyone there. And then the last thing that I put together just on this particular webinar, a few books that I particularly have appreciated as I've been looking through these different areas in my own practice. Change by Design by Tim Brown of IDEO is a really good overview of design thinking and how it works for organizations. For Empathy, Hidden in Plain Sight by Yan Chipchase is a really good look at how organizations start to try and tap into the perspective of lived experience. Conceptual Blockbusting by James Adams is a fantastic resource if you're looking to understand all the different blocks that keep us from creative ideas and how to overcome them. And if you're looking at experimentation, 101 Design Methods by Vijay Kumar is a really good place to get some inspiration about how you could test and explore ideas, particularly in their early and middle stages of development. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to connect with all of you soon.